You ever borrowed something for so long that it just sort of becomes yours? You know what I'm talking about, right? You get something from somebody and maybe you forget that you have it or they forget that you have it, and pretty soon, even though you may have the intention of giving it back, time passes by, you just sort of assume ownership from that. I've got a couple of those things here. This at least do this one first. This big old pipe wrench. Now, I got this, I don't know how many years ago I've got it. I think it's probably moved through at least 3 or 4 states, and it just ends up in my toolbox. And I know that I grabbed it from under the carport one day. For some reason, I needed it. I only need to use it about, maybe once or twice a year. But every time I go and pick it up, I remember that this is not mine. It's actually my dad's. But really, now I'm not going to give it back. So anyway, it's mine now. Here's another little item. I got this out of my office today. You know how people will put their names in the front of books? Well, if you open this book, you'll notice that the name is not my name. This is a book that I borrowed from a preacher way, way back when I was in Oklahoma as a youth minister, and I was getting ready to do a series on something. He said, "Yeah, here's some books, but make sure you give those back." And one thing led to another. I forgot I had them. He forgot I had them. I moved from that town to another town in Oklahoma, and from that town in Oklahoma to a town in Ohio, and then I moved to Texas, and I have no idea where this preacher is anymore. And I'm not going to throw the book away. Obviously, it's a good book, so I'm just going to keep it. This is my book now, even though it really is not my book. You know how that goes. Another item. I got a picture of it. I didn't want to bring it and scare you, but this is a shotgun. And about 17 years ago, I asked my dad if I could borrow his shotgun. And some friends of mine were going to do some bird hunting or some target shooting or something like that, and I wanted to participate. And so Dad said that I could borrow the shotgun, but the problem was it needed a new barrel. The ring attached to the barrel had come loose, and he tried to fix it, but it didn't work. And so if I was going to use the shotgun, I needed to get a new barrel. And so I got the shotgun from him. I bought a new barrel online. I cleaned it up. I got it all oiled up. I got it ready to go, and I took it out, and I used it. Well, unlike that book and that pipe wrench, after a few years, the original owner of that item, my dad, asked if I was going to return it. And as a good son, or maybe even a good person would say, "Sure, I'll bring it to you next time I see you." But I'm apparently not a good son or a good person, because when Dad asked for it, I argued with him. I said, "You're kidding, right? You really want this back?" And I had several reasons why I felt like I didn't need to give it back. Like, for one thing, he didn't need it. He never used it. He wouldn't use it if he had it. There was no reason for him to have this shotgun. He just didn't need it. And the other thing is, I did need it. There were still times where I would go out and do target practice, and we'd go out and do different things. And so I did have a use for it. And I put a lot of work and money into it. That new barrel was $150 or something, and the time that I spent oiling it up and cleaning it up and getting it into the shape that it's in, really, I put all that work into it. But in spite of my reasons, Dad still had the best reason. Regardless of need, and regardless of possession, and regardless of effort and work put into it, he was still the rightful owner of the shotgun. And so I did the only thing I could do. I hid it in my closet and hoped he never thought about it again. And it's still in my house right now. Hope he's not watching this. So. We're in chapter 9 of the Believe series. And the topic of this chapter is stewardship. And the key idea is, I believe everything I am and everything I own belong to God. Now, this is really a profound truth that is life-changing if we let it play out in our lives. It means that God is the owner and that we are the manager. That's the fundamental truth that we need to grasp from this belief. And if that is true, as owner, God doesn't need anything. And as managers, we get everything from God. Everything we get comes from God, whether it be the blessings that are just given to us, or whether the blessings that we earn because of the blessing that God has given us the ability to earn. Whatever it is, everything we get comes from God. And if that's true, as owner, God has rights, and as managers, we have responsibilities. I think a lot of times when it comes to our material possessions and our money, we think we have rights, but in reality, we really have responsibility. It's God, the owner, who has the rights. And as owner, God has a plan, and as managers, we must follow that plan. It's not our money, we got to figure out what the owner wants us to do with it. Unfortunately, I think that we see our physical possessions a little like I see that shotgun. And we get it for so long, we have it so long, we forget that we aren't the rightful owner. And when we hear that God expects us to be generous in giving, whether it be to the church or generous to others around us, we have a similar attitude that I had when Dad asked for that shotgun back. We think, God doesn't need it. If God is really God, if He is really the creator of the universe, He doesn't need my help. And we're going to say, we definitely need it, right? I mean, I really feel like there's a lot of times in my life where I'm coming up short, and I could use a little extra. I could definitely use a little extra. And then we think we worked hard to get it. You probably remember me telling a story of my friend in Ohio who's a preacher there, and he was preaching when he was in Iowa. He was preaching a stewardship sermon, and he talked about how everything you get comes from God. He said it's all God, and the guy stood up in the service, or didn't stand up, but he said out loud in the service, "Not true. I earned every penny." That's kind of the attitude we have, that I worked hard for that money, and so it's mine. But in the end, God is still the rightful owner of everything that we have. Now, as you've heard me say, some preachers are scared of talking about money, and I'm scared not to, because I've experienced firsthand the importance of good stewardship and the blessings that God gives us. I've experienced firsthand how we deal with our finances will help us grow in our faith. It's one of the most tangible lessons that God can give us in how to be faithful. But today, I want to take a broader look at this topic of stewardship. I want to back up just a little bit and not just focus on the expected, but take a look from a little higher perspective. As I was preparing for this sermon, I ran across two sermons by Rick Warren. He wrote The Purpose-Driven Life. He had two sermons on stewardship, and one was entitled The Stewardship of Affluence. And it was a reminder that because we are so blessed monetarily, we have a great responsibility as Christians. He talked about how we, as Christians in this country, are so very well blessed, and we are, you know that. There are some people in this world that would be amazed that we have houses, let alone houses for our cars. That's what a garage really is, right? And if you make, the statistics flee my mind at this point, but it's something like if you make $18,000 a year in your home, you're in the top 2% of the wealthiest people in all the world. And so this responsibility, this great blessing that we have, that you and I have, it comes with great responsibility. And so we should be stewards of that affluence. We should be stewards of that blessing, of that wealth. It's a great reminder. The second sermon that he talked about was called The Stewardship of Influence. And that's what I want to focus on today. I want to focus on that aspect of stewardship this morning. You see, this key idea that I believe everything I am and everything I own belong to God, it mentions two areas in which God has blessed us. First of all, it talks about everything I am, who we are, our talents, our gifts, our abilities. And then he talks about what we have, everything I own. That's your physical, that's your material blessings that God has allowed you to have. And the truth is that God has given us blessings in this area for one big reason: to bring glory to Himself. The reason He blesses us with abilities and talents and gifts is to bring glory to Him. The reason He blesses us financially and monetarily and materially is to bring glory to Him. And we do that through our praises, obviously. We are thankful for God's blessings. So we give Him praise and glory for the things He's given to us. But also, we do it through our influence. That we use those blessings to affect this broken world. And that's what I want to focus on this morning, because God wants us to use everything we are and everything we have to be an influence. Now, before we go any further, let's get on the same page about what influence is, so we can kind of understand what we're talking about. When you think of influence today, a lot of things may come to mind. You may think of fame. You think of people that, if you're on Twitter, how many Twitter followers somebody has. That's influence. You may think of authority. That someone has the authority to make change and to influence people and what they do. Maybe you do think of money. That when someone has a lot of money, they have a lot of influence because they're able to do a lot of things with that money. But the reality is that you really don't need any of those things to have influence. You don't need fame, you don't need authority, and you don't need money. Merriam-Webster.com defines influence as the act or power of producing an effect without apparent exertion of force or direct exercise of command. Influence. I know Merriam-Webster.com is my favorite, but the Cambridge Dictionary has a better definition. The power to affect how someone develops, acts, or thinks. That's what we're talking about when we talk about influence. The power to affect someone's life. How they develop, how they act, or how they think. The truth is that every one of us has influence, and God wants us to use our influence for Him. If you go to Matthew 5, you can see where Jesus talks about how we are salt and light. And that has a very influential effect. Salt and light do. In Matthew 28, Jesus says we're to go and to make disciples, to teach them and to baptize them. And that's an influence that we are called to have. In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, it says, "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." That's influence. And our number one priority as stewards of what God has blessed us with is to be good stewards of that influence. And so here are some things that we can see in the Bible that shows us about increasing our influence as stewards. First of all, number one, we need to recognize your influence. I think when we think about increasing our influence, we often think about gaining an audience. And that can certainly be part of it. For example, one of the things I'm proud of in the last few years in my life is my doctoral dissertation. I'm proud of that for a variety of reasons. I'm proud because it was a lot of hard work. I'm proud that I actually finished. I'm proud that it allowed me to graduate and get a PhD. I'm proud of all those things. But I'm most proud because what I discovered in my research has been a great help to me as a minister. And I believe that it could be a great help to other ministers just like me and other churches just like ours. But not many people want to sit down and read a 332-page dissertation. And so I've tried to get that information out in other ways. By the way, not even my own family. Jocelyn sat down one time and said she was going to read it. I have a bound copy of it. And she made it through half the first page and said, "That's enough today, Daddy." So she'll be done by the time she turns 18 if she continues that pace. So I tried to get that information and kind of condense it and get it out to be helpful in other ways. I've shared that information with professors and ministers in a variety of ways. I've submitted that information to journals. It's been published in different journals. I've presented that information at different conferences. And I've done all that with the hope that I could influence others who are engaged in spiritual formation, and not for my benefit, because you don't get paid for journal articles and conference presentations, but for the benefit of others, that they can take those lessons learned and apply it to their own contexts. Well, so I think there's okay, and I think we too should try to build an audience for the good news we have to share. The information that you have as a Christian is shareable. It's good stuff that we don't want to just keep to ourselves. We want to get it out, and so we should build an audience as we are in this world to be able to share that information. But the best way to increase our influence as stewards of what God has blessed us with is simply to recognize what we already have. It's not about getting more. It's about building an audience. It's not about building an audience necessarily. It's about just recognize the influence that you already have in your life. In Exodus chapter 3, we find Moses in exile from Egypt because he killed a man. He was no longer the prince of Egypt, but he was a shepherd for his father-in-law in a remote area at this time. But God had a plan for him to be an influence. And so you know the story. God gets Moses' attention by appearing as a burning bush. He tells Moses that he is the one that will lead the Israelites out of Egypt, that he is the one that will influence Pharaoh for the glory of God. And of course, Moses is skeptical. He's a little scared. But in Exodus 4, God and Moses have this exchange, starting with verse 2. Then the Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. The Lord said, "Throw it on the ground." Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. Now, there's a couple things we need to realize about this staff that Moses had. First of all, it was representative of who Moses was. That the staff represented who Moses was as a shepherd, his role, his income, his identity to some extent was kind of symbolized by that staff. It wasn't just a stick, it was actually a tool that was invaluable, and it was reflective of who Moses was. But also, the thing we need to realize about the staff, and this may seem obvious, but Moses already had it. That God didn't say to him, here, let me give you an item that will help you influence Pharaoh. He said, what is that in your hand? What's in your hand? And God showed Moses that all he had to do was hand over what he had already had and who he already was. And God would do the rest. And so he handed it over. And you notice what happens is that God then gives that staff, that normal, everyday, old shepherd's crook staff. He had that and he gave it power. And we see, by the way, that Moses continued to use that staff. If you continue to read in the Old Testament, it's the same staff that Moses uses for all the miracles. It's the staff that he holds the water of the Nile, holds in the water of the Nile to turn it into blood. It's the staff that he raises up to split the Red Sea. It's the staff that he uses to strike the rock and water comes out. And from that point on, by the way, it was not called Moses' staff anymore in the Bible. The Bible refers to it as the staff of God. What was in Moses' hand? It was just a normal staff. But when Moses laid it down, God used it in a mighty way to influence the world for his own glory. And so I think the question we have to ask ourselves this morning is, what's in your hand? What's in your hand? I think we often don't disagree that we should be influential for God, but I think we think of it in future terms. That, when I get more knowledge of blank, when I understand the Bible more, when I understand salvation more, when I understand these things, when I can get more knowledge, then I'll be ready to be influential. Or maybe when I get better at something. If I get better at talking to people, if I get better at sharing that good news, if I get better at whatever the case may be, then I can be influential. Or maybe we say when I can afford to blank. I just can't afford to do it now. Maybe when I get some more money, when I get a better job, then I'll finally be able to be comfortable enough that I can share and be influential. Or maybe we say when I have more time to blank. Whenever summer gets here, or whenever school starts, or whenever I retire, or whatever. And we think that's, when that happens, that's when we can be more influential. But the question is what is that in your hand? You've got talents, you've got abilities, everyone in this room does. And you may say, well, I do, but I'm not really that good at the things that I'm good at. Nothing special about me, nothing special about my talents, nothing special about my abilities, nothing special about those things. Well, that doesn't matter. What's in your hand? Use it for God. You've got time. Well, I am so busy. Raise your hand if you think you're busy. Go ahead. No, go ahead. I know. Everybody raise your hand because every one of you think you're busy. We all think that. We know we're busy. Doesn't matter. Use your time for God. You've got relationships. Maybe you say, yeah, but most of them are Christians. I mean, I hang around with Christians a lot. Okay. But our calling is not just to make more disciples, it's also to make better disciples, to help disciple one another. Or you say, well, I don't want to force it with my non-Christian friends. Well, okay, don't force it, but be intentional. Allow God to use that time. What's in your hand? You've got money. And some of you are saying, yeah, right. Look at my bank account. We got to remember, it's not the size of the gift that matters, it's the size of the God. And if God can take an old staff and use it in a mighty way, think of what he can do when we give sacrificially, we give cheerfully for his glory. What is that in your hand? Recognize the potential influence you already have. And God says he'll use whatever we have if we just lay it down, if we submit it to him. And then, by the way, it can be known as God's from that point forward. Number two, second thing we should do is exercise your influence. Once we recognize that we do indeed have influence, we need to put that influence into action by using our blessings for God's purposes and God's glory. Rick Warren gave 5 ways that we can be intentional about our influence. There are 5 different levels that increase in difficulty and increase in influence as we go along. The first one is very simple. Smile. I know it sounds cheesy. It sounds cheesy. But if you've ever had a bad day and somebody smiles at you, it kind of makes it better, right? There was a time when Carrie and I were down in Knoxville when I was working on my master's. We had to go down for orientation. I had just started. And I'll never forget, we were driving along up I-75 headed north back to Ohio, and we're driving along on the interstate, and all of a sudden the truck next to us honks. I'm like, what in the world? And so I look over, and there is the truck driver holding on a popsicle stick the big cheesy cutout smile. It was the cheesiest thing you ever saw in your life. And you know what we did? We laughed. And our day got a little bit better. Just because that guy went out of his way to do that. I can't imagine how many motorists he's scared and shocked and made laugh over the years just by holding that popsicle stick smile up over his face. Proverbs 15 verse 30 says, bright eyes gladden the heart. A happy face makes people happy inside. The world is a grouchy place. The world is a big-time grouchy place. But if we can just share a little joy in our face, then we can have a little bit, just a little bit, of influence for good in this world. Number 2, sympathize with people. 2 Corinthians 1, verse 3, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in trouble so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. See, we can increase our influence whenever we show people that we care. Because the old saying goes, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. You know that to be the truth in your own life. The people that care about you the most are the ones who have the most influence on you. There are countless examples of how I could talk about you influencing me and caring for me. A church family is a big part of that care, of that sympathy. But I like to, there's just one that when I was prepping for this sermon, one that stuck out for me. It was from my good friend Paul. You know, when Dad had his accident, I received so many loving texts and caring calls and messages. And I know you prayed for myself and for our family. And I was just overwhelmed with sympathy. But this one stuck out to me as I was preparing, because one of the first ones I received was from Paul. I was sitting in the hospital in Wichita, Kansas, not having any idea what the future held. And his text simply said, I will head that way at a moment's notice. Just say the word. And I knew he meant it. Now, that in itself is a wonderful expression of love and care. But it's words and acts like that that will strengthen and deepen a relationship. And when we strengthen and deepen relationships with sympathy, we increase our levels of trust. There are not many people in this world that I trust and can be influenced by than Paul, because that's a repeated thing that has happened in my life. He's shown sympathy. He's shown that he cares. And it's true for many of you as well. The people that we know care the most are the ones that can influence us the most. Number 3, serve people. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. That's the Apostle Paul talking. That even though I don't belong to anybody, even though I don't have to do any of this stuff, I have decided to serve everyone so that I might, what? Win as many as possible. Serving with a purpose. With the purpose of leading them to Christ, to knowing that we can be an influence if we serve them. Matthew 5, verse 16, Jesus said this, in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Now, notice what it says. Let your light shine so they will see your good deeds and glorify. Why? So that it will glorify God. You see, this is really kind of an economy issue, if you will. In the world's economy, the ones with the most power and authority are the ones that are seen with the most amount of influence. The ones in the high places who have a lot of followers, have a lot of power, who have a lot of influence. That's the ones that seem to make the real influence. And by the way, it's absolutely not bad to have power or authority. And it's absolutely good to use that power and authority, whatever you have, for God's glory. Again, what's in your hand? It could be a lot or it could be a little. But in God's economy, greatness of influence is actually measured quite differently. Jesus said this in Matthew 23. He said, the greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Simply put, the more we use our blessings to serve others, the more influence we will have for God's glory. The more we use our talents to serve others, the more influence we have. The more we use our time to serve others, the more influence we're going to have. The more we use our resources to serve others, the more influence we're going to have. Servanthood is influence. Number 4, speak up. Speak up. Psalm 107, verse 2. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. I like the way the New American Standard says it. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. I think there's a song like that. There was an old quote by a guy named St. Francis of Assisi that used to be pretty popular. In fact, when I was at Ozark Christian College as in my freshman year of college, we had dorm T-shirts, and like every dorm had a T-shirt, and then every floor of every dorm had a T-shirt. It was weird, but we had a dorm T-shirt. And on the back of the T-shirt had this quote. It said, "Preach the gospel always. When necessary, use words." And we looked at that quote and we thought, whoa, that's a deep thought. And we thought as freshmen in college we were being so cerebral by putting that on the back of a dorm T-shirt. Preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words. And I've heard sort of variations of that in people's lives. They use it in their lives as well. Things like maybe your life might be the only sermon someone hears. You heard that one before? Or I share the good news by the way I live my life. Now, they all sound good, and certainly living a good life is important, but the truth of the gospel is that it's necessary to use words. It's good news, and news requires words. And so, maybe St. Francis should have said, preach the gospel always use words. Because that's really the way that we spread the good news of Jesus. We need to tell our story. But there's another way we can be influential by speaking up. Proverbs 31, verse 8. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. And we can be an influence for God's glory if we speak up for the causes that God cares about. That's one of the roles of the church, by the way, is to speak on God's behalf, to say the things that God would say if he was physically standing here. Speak up for the things that God cares about. We can be an influence for God's glory if we support those who are fighting for the causes that God cares about. We can be an influence for God's glory if we communicate God's love and mercy and power to a broken world. But that requires action. It requires speaking up. And the last thing is sacrifice. Remember, God first asked Moses, what is in your hand? And then he says, that's not the end of it, by the way. He didn't say, what is in your hand? Okay, good, you got a staff. He says, throw it on the ground. Give it up. Relinquish it. Let it go. Let it be out of your control. And church, if we are to be good stewards who reflect the belief that God owns all and all we have, all we are and all we have, that means we're going to have to give it up. It means we're going to have to let go of it. It means that we're going to have to relinquish control of our talents, abilities, of material blessings as well. And when we sacrifice in that way, not only do we increase our influence, but we become more like God. Because as you know, for God so loved the world, he gave. We can become more like God when we give. But there's one more way to increase our influence. That's to maximize your influence. Ephesians 5. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. I believe that one of the big reasons, probably the biggest reason we lack influence for God's glory is because we waste our resources. We just waste it. When it comes to who we are, when it comes to our talents and abilities, we waste our resources when we focus on the wrong goals. If your goal is not of God, if you're focusing on earthly things and not godly things, guess what? You can use your talents and your abilities for those purposes. But if you're focusing on earthly things, if you're focusing on temporary things and not eternal things, then essentially what you're doing is you're doing a lot of good that's not going to last. Or you're using your abilities or your talents in a way that's not going to last. And if it's not going to last, it's kind of a waste. That's why I never make my bed, by the way. Because I always sleep in it the next night. Why waste the time of doing something that's going to get undone? Parents are looking at me like, why did you say that? No. But that's what it is that we focus on the wrong goals and we waste our resources. We waste our resources when we allow fear to hinder us. Whenever we're scared of failure, or we're scared of discomfort, or we're scared of danger, or whatever the case may be, and so we just allow that to stifle us, to keep us from serving God, to keep us from being active on God's behalf, to keep us from using our talents and abilities in dangerous ways and ways that God has called us to. And so whenever you've got something that God has given you and you're too scared to use it, it's a waste. It's going to waste. We waste our resources when we focus our energy on the wrong place. Let me tell you something I've learned now that I've just turned 40. You only have so much energy. You can only do so much. You're going to run out of energy. And so if you don't give your energy to the best things, if you don't give your best energy to the things that God has called you to, you're just wasting it. Because at the end of the day, if you've done all your energy for one thing and left God out of it, you're not going to have anything left to give. And by the way, if you use it on something other than God and you have nothing left to give God, you've wasted it. We waste our resources when we focus our time on the wrong things. You know, and I know, we only have so many hours in the day. We only have so much time that we can deal with. And also, as I've turned 40, I've learned that life is not guaranteed. And your time on this earth quicker as you get older, slips away from you. And so we focus our time on the wrong things, and so it hinders our influence, and we're not good stewards when we do that. When we focus on the wrong goals, when we allow fear to hinder us, when we focus our time and energy on the wrong place, we're not being good stewards of what God has given to us. But also, when it comes to what we have, we waste our resources when we forget that God owns it all. You see, maximizing our influence means not only that we give generously back to God and help others, but we start by being good managers with what God has blessed us with. Being generous people for God's glory, it starts with every financial decision being a spiritual decision. That if everything belongs to God and He's the owner and I'm only the manager, then every dollar I spend is a spiritual decision. Now that's kind of heavy. I got to be honest with you. It's kind of heavy. But if we budget, if we act like it's all God's, then every decision it's got to be a spiritual decision. I was at the retreat in Knoxville a few weeks ago with the PhD teachers and students at Johnson University. I was riding back to the airport with a couple of professors. And we were just talking about restaurants for some reason. It came up, and we were talking about that. And this lady, a colleague of mine, said her family hardly ever eats out. And she made a statement that I really liked. She said, I like traveling a lot more than I like eating out. And she said, we made a decision a long time ago that we want to go to Hawaii, and we want to go to the Caribbean, we want to go to Alaska, we want to go to all these places. And we realized that we can't eat out all the time and still afford to be able to do those things. Well, when it comes to our stewardship of our material blessings, I think that probably most of us would say, yeah, I want to use my stuff for God's glory. I want to use my money for God's glory. But the thing is that there's only so much that we have. And so if we're going to go traveling, we can't eat out all the time. And if we're going to serve God, there's some things maybe that we need to do to be better stewards of what God has given us. Being generous people for God's glory, it means that reordering our priorities and understanding that 100% of what God has blessed us with is something that we have to be concerned with, not just the 10%. I used to think, okay, God says a tithe, we get the tithe, and we could talk about, by the way, whether the tithe is accurate in the New Testament. The Old Testament says a tithe. New Testament goes beyond that, by the way. In the Old Testament, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Jesus says, but I tell you, don't even hate your neighbor. Old Testament says, don't commit adultery. Jesus said, but I'm telling you, it's beyond that. And so I would guess if you're going to follow that pattern along, the Old Testament says give 10%, and I think Jesus just would say to you, everything. Whatever it is, everything. And so we got to consider 100% that it's God's, and then understand that that's what we should be concerned about. You see, God expects the same thing from us, no matter what our talents may be. That's a hard thing to come into to understand, especially as a minister. That really, God has not called me to grow a church. God has not called me to do that because I can't do that. God has called me to serve Him faithfully, to preach His word, and to love, and to lead, and to develop leaders. That's what God has called me to do, and God will take care of the rest on His time and in His way. God has not called you to necessarily do big things. He's just called you to be faithful. I love the story of Joseph, Jesus' earthly father, apropos on Father's Day. Because, we don't learn a lot about Joseph in the Bible. But we do know that his task was huge. Even though we don't learn about very much of it. He was tasked with being the earthly father of Jesus. And so you know what his big call was? It wasn't to go out like Peter and preach to thousands of people and have people come to him. It wasn't like Paul where he was going to go and plant churches. It wasn't any of those things, to do miracles and all that. That's not what Joseph was called to. He was called to discipline his son and to teach him how to be a man, to take care of him and to feed him. Things that we certainly think are important, but they're not very flashy. God just calls us to be faithful, no matter what our talents and abilities are. God expects the same thing from us, no matter what our bank account balance is. If you're a billionaire, your responsibility is no greater or no less than the homeless person when it comes to finances. That's just the reality of it. The number doesn't matter. God wants us to live out this reality that I believe everything I am and everything I own should belong to God. And so to increase our influence, we first of all got to recognize it. Recognize your influence. What's in your hand? What's in your hand? What has God given you? Who are the people you are already influencing? What's the gifts? What are the tools that God has already provided for you to influence? Are you exercising your influence? Putting that into practice day after day after day? Are you maximizing your influence by being good stewards of your time, your energy, your money? When we recognize our influence, when we exercise our influence, when we maximize our influence, we do all that, then we will be good stewards. The kind of stewards that God intended for us to be, the kind of stewards that influence as God has called us to. And when God's people are good stewards of God's influence, some pretty cool things can happen. Edward Kimball had influence. Most of you probably haven't heard of him, and that's okay. Most people haven't heard of Edward Kimball. But Kimball was a Sunday school teacher in Boston who taught a class full of young boys, and he wanted very desperately for them to come to faith in Jesus. And so he decided he was going to be intentional about his influence. One of the boys had a job as a stock boy at Holton's shoe store. His name was Dwight. And Dwight had a tendency to fall asleep in Sunday school, unlike anyone in this congregation, of course. He had a tendency to fall asleep during Sunday school, and so Edward decided that I'm going to go out of the Sunday school room, and I'm going to actually go to where he works. I'm going to talk to him there. And so he went on a Saturday into Holton's shoe store, went back to the stock room, and he started to talk to Dwight. He talked to him about Jesus and the love he has for him and what God has to offer through his son. And that day, in the stockroom, Dwight decided to give his life to Christ. Well, Dwight went on to have a unique ministry, including spreading the good news of Jesus, not just in the United States, but on another continent as well. That's pretty cool, but there's more to the story, because there was a man named Wilbur who came to a relationship with Jesus through Dwight's ministry. And Wilbur became a preacher who preached the good news to thousands of people in his life. And there was a baseball player in the audience of one of his sermons. His name was Billy, and God used Wilbur to bring Billy to him. And after that, Billy quit baseball, became a preacher himself. And it was one of Billy's sermons that a man named Mordecai came to a relationship with Jesus. Mordecai was a little rough around the edges. He wasn't perfect. He had some flaws, some of them very public. But he told others about the redemption available through Jesus. He preached all over the country, including Port Arthur and Beaumont. He preached in those two cities. But it was in Charlotte, North Carolina, that a high school student named William reluctantly went to hear Mordecai preach, mostly out of curiosity of seeing a show. He thought it'd be entertaining to go watch this man preach. But he was intrigued when he heard the message, and he returned the next night at the revival to hear the next sermon. And that night, William went forward during the invitation to publicly declare that he wanted Jesus to intervene on his behalf in his life. You probably haven't heard of Edward Kimball, that persistent Sunday school teacher in Boston, but you almost certainly have heard of the boy named William who came to faith of Jesus in Charlotte. His name, you probably know him as Billy Graham. And that's a beautiful picture of how our influence can be used by God. One person who leads another, who influences another, who influences another. And you can trace that, the thousands of people who've heard about Jesus through that long line of preachers, back to a Sunday school teacher who decided he was going to go to a shoe store in Boston. And as the saying goes, you can count the apples on the tree, but only God knows how many apples are in a single seed. What's in your hand? What's in your hand? What has God given you? He's not calling you to be world-changing, groundbreaking, popular, famous. He's just calling you to be faithful. He's calling us to be good stewards. Let's pray. God, I do thank you for the ways that you've blessed us. I thank you for the gifts and abilities you've given to each one of us, the things that make us unique and the things that would give us a place in your kingdom, a place of productivity, a place of fulfillment. And I thank you for the material blessings that you've given to each one of us as well. I thank you for how you've blessed us, and I pray, Lord, that with both sets of gifts that we're more attentive to how we are using them for you. That we are persistent, that we are intent on being good stewards of the things that you've given to us. And I pray, Lord, that in our faithfulness, as we apply those things, that you will multiply them. You will take those gifts, you'll take those things that you've given us, the things in our hand, that we give them to you and that you turn them into something miraculous. But Lord, I just pray you'll help us to, first and foremost, just to be good stewards, to know what we have, to recognize it, and to use it according to your glory, according to your plan. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's stand as we sing.